Hello students, thank you for joining me today. Our live lesson today is going to be on the evolutionary theory and natural selection from Module 5, specifically lessons 5.01 and 5.02 is what we're going to be touching on today. So today, a few things we will be discussing, the evolution as the theory, natural selection, the mechanisms of evolution, and the sources of evidence that are going to back up the theory of evolution. So to start with, I want to just remind everyone that the definition of evolution is simply change over time. And Darwin's theory of evolution is the process by which our modern organisms today have descended from ancient organisms over time. And please remember that a theory is a well-supported and testable explanation. So it just means that it is the idea that has been supported with evidence over and over again, so it has been accepted as the explanation for how a mechanism or a phenomena has occurred, and will remain as the acceptable idea until evidence contrary to what has been presented comes into play. So the theory of evolution began and became popular from Darwin, and it started with his voyage on the Beagle. So his voyage is that he actually went around some of the different South American countries, as well as Africa and Australia. And he is best known for his trips around the Galapagos Islands, which is right off the coast of South America. And the name of his ship was Beagle, and that is why it is known as the Voyage on the Beagle. So he had traveled on that, and when he was doing his travels, he was recording his findings on the different organisms and animals and plants that he saw on these different locations and some of the differences. And his findings led to his description of what we now know as the theory of evolution. So I just wanted to share with you some of his findings. In particular, the tortoises were a big one around the Galapagos Islands. He noticed that depending on the different island that the tortoise was found on, they had some different characteristics. So the Pinta Island tortoise had very long front limbs, as did the Hood Island, but the necks of these different tortoises were different. So if you notice on the Isabella Island, the tortoise's neck was much shorter, whereas on the Hood and Pinta Island, they were much longer, longest on the Hood. So, you know, Darwin made this to understand based on the food that was available on these different islands, depended on some of these different traits that they are probably showing. Same thing was true with the finches. He also noticed finches are a type of bird, and the beaks on the finches, depending on the island that they were on and the food source that was available, were different. So on an island where the food source was primarily leaves, we had a much more pointed, straight beak, whereas on the island where we needed to be able to get the fruits and the buds, we had a little bit more of a curved beak that was showing on the finches. So again, their finches had different beaks depending on the different food source that was available to them. Some other things that helped to shape his thinking, besides the findings of these different organisms and animals on these different areas, were some of the findings that different scientists were also had either already determined or were finding at the same time. James Hutton, his work showed that was more of geology and showed that the Earth is much older than just thousands of years, that it was, you know, millions to billions of years old. So that gave Darwin the idea that, of course, you know, things are much older than we may seem. Charles Lyell, he went with that and said that the changes over time, the Earth will actually change over that time with different features being built up and torn down. So as the Earth aged, it also changed in its actual topography, with whether it had, tall mountains or valleys, hills, different things. Volcanoes were being built, cliffs, all those types of things, and this was being shown in the rock history of the different areas on the Earth. Thomas Malthus was a population scientist, and he was noticing that human population in particular, but this was related to other populations as well, grow much faster than the Earth's food supply can keep up. So there has to be something limiting those populations, otherwise the food will run out and the populations will cease to exist. And then finally, earlier from Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, earlier than Darwin, my apologies, the scientist Lamarck had come up with the idea of inheritance of acquired traits and this idea of use and disuse. And what he was basically saying is that organisms would acquire the traits. So for instance, if a giraffe needed to be able to reach taller trees, that they would will themselves and have to use their necks more and more and stretch over time, and so eventually they would develop longer necks. Kind of like how if you were to go work out, the more you work out, the more muscle you build, which is true for muscle building, but not necessarily true for all of our genetic traits. Of course, he had no idea about genetics at the time, so he was just basing it on things that he observed. So it would be like saying that if you wanted to have blue hair and you willed yourself to have blue hair and kept trying and kept dyeing and dyeing it and dyeing it and turning it blue, turning it blue, turning it blue, eventually your hair would just become blue. We know that now that is ludicrous, and we can't just will ourselves to have different traits. But his idea that traits were needed for certain things and that we would develop them did kind of give a leeway into Darwin's idea of traits being necessary for survival. So here's just an example of Lamarck's giraffes. Again, these are the giraffes that he would say, they were shorter-necked giraffes, and as the food source became higher and higher and less available at the lower levels, then the giraffes would have to work harder to get to that food source, stretching their necks and until they could reach it, and they would continue to stretch and eventually build up a longer neck, thinking that the neck length was more like a muscle building trait rather than an actual genetic trait. And that your traits developed based on need and development, which is not the actual way that we inherit traits. So that brings us to Darwin's theory of natural selection, which is based on these 4 main points that make up what we know now as natural selection. So his theory of evolution states that organisms evolve or change over time and acquire their traits from ancestors that have been passed along from one generation to the next over a long series of time, and it's based on these 4 main points of natural selection. The first is that there is variation in a population. So we know that not everybody and not every individual in the population is the same. We're going to have differences. Those variations can be because of the traits themselves, can be because of mutations that occurred in the genes, but they're there. We also know that some of those variations are more favorable or fit for the individuals than others. Okay, so obviously with those giraffes, when the food source became harder to obtain at a lower level, the giraffes that happened to have a variation of the longer neck were going to have more favorable traits. They were able to reach the higher trees, whereas the shorter-necked giraffes had a less favorable trait because they were able to reach the higher food source. We also know, based on observations of many different organisms, that there are usually more organisms produced than will be able to survive in a population. This is very true for many, many organisms. You see this with plants where they produce multiple thousands of seeds, some of which never end up becoming a plant. We know this with fish and other organisms that produce, thousands of eggs and things that only few of them end up actually surviving. So more organisms are produced than will survive. And what ends up happening is that only the organisms that end up with the favorable traits or have those more fit traits that are going to allow them to be successful in that environment are going to be the ones that survive, and therefore they pass those traits on by reproducing. And those favorable traits then become the only traits seen in a population. Again, this takes generations and generations and generations to finally become where they are an adaptation or a trait that is necessary for that organism to survive, and therefore seen throughout the entire population. So this is what we sometimes refer to as survival of the fittest, because those with the favorable or more fit traits are the ones that survive and continue to reproduce. So I'm going to show you a little example here. We have these blobs. This is a species of blob, and you can see that they're different colors, and some of them have these beaks, some of them do not. So there's all this variation. Here's that variation we talked about. There's variation in this population. The little purple dots at the bottom are the food source. Some are underneath the surface, and some are towards the top of the surface. Okay? So they eat these little purple blobs that live on the surface or underground. All right, so we now know that if there was, say, a hot summer, so during a particularly hot year, the food on the surface becomes less abundant. Okay? So there's more competition now for the food because the food source has been dampened and decreased based on that extreme heat. So now the blobs are going to have to compete a little bit more to be able to get food because it's not as readily available. So the blobs that have the ability to dig into the soil and to go underground are going to have a better chance of being able to reach more food. So we can see that the blobs with the beaks are able to dig and get these purple food sources that are underground, whereas the ones without can't. So they're only left to what's on the surface, which is going to be depleted quickly. So many of the blobs died. The ones with the X's are the ones that are dying here. The ones that survived, notice, are majority the ones with the beaks because they could get the food that was underground. We do have one little guy over here without a beak that managed to survive, which can happen sometimes, but you can see that majority that were surviving were the ones with the beaks. So that leaves them to basically mate with one another because that's all that's left. And when they reproduce, obviously if they all majority have the beaks, they're going to pass that on to their next generation. And therefore we can see in the next generation, now we have mostly organisms with the beaks. There are a few without that came from that one combination because we had a little guy that did manage to survive. But as we continue and continue, there's going to be fewer and fewer of those without the beaks because the ones with the beaks are going to be at a stronger advantage for surviving and reproducing, and the ones without the beaks will end up dying off until eventually there are no longer any blobs without beaks. And that is natural selection. So again, variation. Some variations are favorable, and the competition will determine what is favorable and what is not. Those with those favorable survive, and then they reproduce and pass them on. So while we're talking about it, so that's natural selection. That happens in nature. Nature selects based on what's needed to survive in an environment. Humans have used that artificially. We have actually done this ourselves, where we actually select variations that we find useful in things like plants and animals, and we breed them so that they produce similar animals or plants. You can see this is done a lot with our food sources like cows and chickens, where we actually have the breeding of the bigger, stockier animals so that we get bigger and stockier offspring. We see this in the production of different types of plants and fruits and vegetables, where we can get the bigger and brighter fruits and vegetables by artificially selecting the pollination of the plants. So we can do this ourselves with artificial selection, but it's not being selected for survival purposes. In this case, it's being selected by what we find most useful or what we want to see more often. So that's why it's called artificial. Natural selection is what happens in nature, that is selected by the environment and what is necessary to survive in that environment. Some mechanisms that lead to those natural selection to occur and that evolution to happen is gene flow, where we just have the movement of individuals in and out of populations in different locations. So as barriers come down, traveling becomes more abundant. Being able to hitchhike. Even animals and plants and stuff hitchhike on boats and different things, and being brought by humans from one area to another. That makes the genes, the traits that are available to populations, become more intermingled, and so that can bring new variations into an area which may be more favorable than others. Of course, mutations, that's just a natural thing that can happen, where in the genetics there's mutations in the DNA and the genes, and that can cause a new variation to pop up. And then, of course, genetic drift is another mechanism, and that's where we get changes in our traits that are available, or gene pool that's available due to random or chance events. So things like natural disasters may come through and wipe out a whole section of a population, limiting the variation that is in a population and the number of organisms available to reproduce. You might have reproductive isolation, as seen in this picture down here with the two flowers. We have the orange flowers on one side of the mountain and the yellow flowers on the other side. At one point, when those mountains were not there, there was probably a mix of these traits because the pollen would be able to intermingle with one another. But as the mountains developed, they are now isolated from one another, and therefore in different niches and have different reproductive habits, and the traits are different now depending based on their niches and not being able to intermix. Climate change, changing the environment, making it become warmer. We're seeing that in the poles where the glaciers are melting, and so that's causing a change in what is needed to be able to survive in those areas with the warmer weather and the less habitat for certain animals. And so that's going to cause changes in what traits are more favorable for survival. And so what happens is we start out with a parent species, and over time that parent species ends up splitting into different species based on the changes that are necessary to survive in their different environments. And that continues so on and so forth. So now let's talk a little bit about the evidence that supports evolution. There are four main types of evidences that we have that show that evolution does take place over time. One is the fossil record. We can also look at living organisms and compare their structures, both homologous and vestigial structures that we see that are similar within different organisms. We can look at the embryology, which is the development of a fetus, and how similar some are depending on the different organisms we're looking at. And then also biochemical evidence, like the DNA and the proteins that are found in different organisms. So starting with fossils, our fossil records show us first the extreme numbers of organisms that are extinct. Shows a lot of extinct animals, and not just fossils aren't just of animals. We do have some fossils of plant imprints, so we can look at plants too. But primarily, we think of fossils. We think of animals, but they again show us the extreme number of extinct animals. Actually, it's thought that 99% of all organisms that once lived on Earth are now extinct. So that shows us that there's obviously been some changes and at new variations and adaptations that have come along to create these new species. The fossils can show us similarities between those extinct animals and the animals that are alive today. So they show that changes have been made, but there are similarities to former organisms that once lived on the Earth. And the layers of the Earth, the rocks and things like that, help us in giving us a time scale as to when that species was alive and when they actually died out. So it can give us an idea of the day and age of when they were on Earth. So this is a little chart showing camel evolution based on fossil record, and you can kind of see the skull and teeth and the limb bones and how they have changed over the years as the camel has thought to have evolved from this smaller, almost dog-like structure organism to kind of like a deer, and then finally into what we now know as our present-day camel. Again, changing as the environment changed and what was necessary for the survival of that species to last in their environment. And the present-day organisms, we look at similar structures. Homologous structures are similar structures when we look at them in their actual form. But when we look at their function, they have much different function. But if you actually look at the bone structure, it is very similar, showing that there was most likely a common ancestor at some point because they developed in similar ways. It's just that the function changed as the need to survive changed for that particular organism. So homo means the same. Okay, so that's where that comes from. Homologous structure are similar structures. So we can see here we have the human arm on the far left of this diagram, and then the cat, whale, and bat going from left to right. And they all have one main upper arm bone, or bone at the top, and then there's two bones that connect to that beneath it. And then they tend to have these more smaller bones that make up hands or finger-like structures. Now obviously the whale is more of a fin, so those individual finger-like structures don't necessarily have independent functions, but you can see that they are still there. Same with the bat, forms a wing, and even though one of those finger-like projections does stick out, majority are not necessarily going to have an independent function as they are webbed together. But they are still present as they are in the human. So you can see that these are all types of mammals, and that makes sense because all mammals would have had some sort of a common ancestor at some point, and this shows here that they share similar structures in their limbs. Vestigial structures are another part that we look at, that we can say that there was some former ancestor that was common to them because of remnants of a structure that no longer has any use but is still present, showing that at one point in time they must have had a structure that was used in their ancestry. So a vestigial structure is a present-day structure that no longer has an actual purpose but was most likely a useful structure to an ancestor. So you can see here in the whales we have hip bones. The pelvic bones are still present in the whale. Obviously, they do not have legs or walk or anything like that, but this just gives us an indication that at one point in time, an ancestor of the whale most likely was land-bearing and able to walk and go on land and had basically legs or back limbs because those bones are still present. We know that there are leg bones or pelvic bones that are in snakes. There are also some vestigial structures in humans, like the appendix is thought to be remnants of when humans used to have more of a vegetative diet and helped with the digestion of vegetables and seeds and harder nuts, things like that. And possibly has a role in our immune system. So there are just different structures that are considered vestigial that are present but no longer necessary. So that shows possible common ancestor at some point. Now, because we are talking about those, I did want to share with you what an analogous structure is, which is not something that necessarily support or shows that there's common ancestors, but it is a term that you do need to be familiar with. An analogous structure is going to be those that actually function the same way, but it's only because they are in similar environments, so they developed a similar trait. They don't necessarily have a recent ancestor. So the bat wing, the butterfly wing, and the bird wing are all examples here. The bird and the bat are going to be homologous, but when compared to the butterfly, they're analogous. The butterfly is not considered a common or more recent ancestor to those because the butterfly is an insect. So, and the other two are mammals. So if you look at the actual structure of that butterfly wing, there are no bones within it. It is an exoskeleton that makes up that butterfly wing. So even though the wings are shaped or in a similar shape and they are actual wings, the trait itself is similar in function because they are in similar environments, meaning they have to be able to fly and they live in the air, in the sky, basically. But their ancestry is much more further removed. They're not sharing a similar ancestor in any recent history based on the structure itself. All right, going back to the evidence that supports the evolution and the ancestry similarities, we look at embryology. An embryo is the earliest stage of growth and development of both plants and animals. So it's when the egg and the sperm fertilize, and right after the zygote starts to reproduce and build cells, it becomes an embryo. And if you look at the embryos of these different organisms, human, pig, which are both mammals, reptile, and bird, they're all very similar in this embryo stage. You can see that they have the same overall shape. They have tails. They have little pouches, pharyngeal, what are called pharyngeal pouches at the throat, which are basically like gills to be able to survive in the amniotic fluid in their development. So that shows that as they develop in that very similar way at the very beginning, that there must have been a common ancestor at some point because they are developing in the same way. Now obviously as the development continues, they develop different traits that were going to become necessary for survival for that particular species in their specific environment. And the last thing that we look at for evidence is the biochemistry. If you compare the DNA of species, then you will find that there are more similarities in species that are more closely related. So the more similarities we see in their DNA and proteins, the more closely related they are. The less similarities we find, the further they're down the chain as to when they had a common ancestor. So if we look at humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans, you can see in this strand of chromosome here that the orangutan, there's not a whole lot. The blue, what you're looking for is for the blues to match up, okay, and then for the grays to match up. And as we move from the orangutan to the gorilla, we start to see a little bit more of a matching between the chimp and the human. And when you get to the actual, just the chimp and the human, it's pretty close to being exact. Now this is just one particular part, but that shows that the chimp and the human have a more recent common ancestor versus the human and the orangutan. But there's still some similarities there, so they're down the chain, but we could go further and further and further. And I just thought these stats were a little interesting just to kind of get an idea. The genetic similarity between a human and a mouse is 85%. Makes perfect sense because a mouse, again, is a mammal, just like a human. Same thing with the human and a cow, it's 80%. Again, they're both mammals, so it makes sense that they would, kind of be on the high side. Whereas if you compare a human with a fruit flies are insects. They're not mammals, okay? So there's going to be a bigger difference because they're less, there's a longer time span between a similarity in ancestor there, and so it's only 61% of genetic similarity. So the more similarity we find, the more closely related and more recent the ancestor. And again, when we say ancestor, even when we talk recent ancestor, we're still talking hundreds of thousands to millions of years ago. So that's what we still consider recent. Does not happen overnight or within, a decade or a century or whatever. It takes lots and lots of time. So just to sum up, also remember that an adaptation is going to be any variation that aids an organism's chances of survival in its environment. So we call them traits or characteristics that are more fit, but when they become something that is common in that population and seen in pretty much every individual in the population, and we know is something that they need to be able to survive, that's why every individual ends up having it. It is then known as an adaptation. So the long snouts of an anteater, that would be considered an adaptation. The fins of a whale, those are adaptations. They, weren't necessarily there to begin with in their first ancestor, but developed as a necessity to survive. And according to Darwin's theory, adaptations in a species will develop over many generations. Again, we're talking thousands to millions of years of development. This is not something that happens overnight or within one generation or things like that. And it's important to remember that it is populations that are evolving, not individuals. So there will always be pockets of individuals in a population that may not have the exact same variations or adaptation because of mutations and things like that. It is a population as a whole that we're looking at. Those adaptations have to be seen in the majority of the population to be considered an adaptation and to be considered something that has been evolved over time. We're not going to be able to just look at one individual at a time. It's something that takes a whole entire population to become. So with the giraffes, just because in the early, when they first had variation of short necks, long necks, medium necks, it was many generations before they pretty much all have long necks. And throughout that time, there were going to be some short-necked or medium-necked ones along the way, but that's why it's a whole population that's evolving, not the individual. All right, so that is the quick little review covering the 5.01 and 5.02 from our evolution module, Module 5. And I also just wanted to take this time just to talk real quick about the assignment for 5.02. The assignment that is described in the lesson under the activity page for 5.02 is very confusing. The directions are very confusing. It's not a very reliable lab to do because if it's not done correctly, or if even if done correctly, it doesn't always turn out just because of the nature of the lab. So I have developed an alternative virtual lab I'd rather you do, which I think you'll get a more realistic idea of the evolutionary relationships that we're trying to see here. And so I just wanted to make sure that you will do this alternate lab, please. So please do not follow the directions that are in the lesson under the activity for 5.02. Instead, when you go to the assessments list and you click on your 5.02 as if you're going to submit it, there's going to be a little blue box at the top that's going to say, "Attention students, please use the following alternate lab." And there is a link for you to click on to take you to the virtual lab. And this is what the virtual lab looks like over here in the right-hand corner. You're going to see this picture here. And there's going to be some things for you to select and something, interactions for you to kind of go through. And there is I've already typed up a lab report for you to do so that you can complete it with the directions to follow, so you don't have to read through all the different directions that are over here in the side panel of the virtual lab. I've got it already set out for you because I've told you exactly which mutation I want you to select. And so you're going to use that lab report link in order to do, and you'll follow through the directions. There's a few places for you to enter in a hypothesis and some variables, and then some data that you're going to be collecting as you follow through those directions, and then there's some questions for you to answer. And this will be the document that you'll need to submit for grading to go along with that virtual lab that I want you to do. And I have, let me see, make sure I'm going to, I'm also have for you a file to, and you should be getting prompted right now to go ahead and save this file that I have uploaded, and it's the lab report file. So that way you have it in a Word document that you can type directly on, because the link that is listed on the assessments is a Google form. So that means you'll have to copy and paste it or download it into your own Word document to be able to type on it. You can't type directly on the Google document because that's my original. But this file that I'm sharing with you right now, that again you're being prompted to save, will allow you to type directly on it. All right, and of course if you have any questions at all about that lab or about any of these concepts, please make sure you contact me. I'll be happy to go over anything with you and help you out. And I do appreciate you for joining me today. Those of you who have joined me, I will be writing down your name, and you will be gaining an extra 10 points on your points earned for your Module 5 exam as a thank you for attending the live lesson today. If you are watching this as a recording, I'm sorry, but that will not apply to you. You will not be able to get those 10 points because I have no way of tracking the recordings and who watches them. But I do appreciate you taking the time to come back and watch this as a recording. And hopefully next time we do a live lesson, you'll be able to join us in person. Again, thank you all for joining me, and have a wonderful day.